Don't you just hate that song?
Well, we're starting tonight's episode off with a bang for sure. Before we get started, the views and opinions expressed on this broadcast are not those necessarily of the SCV, its GEC, nor any division, brigade, camps, or other subsidiaries, strictly those of ours who are expressing them. Good evening, everyone. I hope y'all enjoy that little bit of a joke. Conroe here with Moose, Carl, and our special guest, Ron Walters. How are y'all doing this evening?
Good to see you.
Doing great.
Doing good.
I was going to do a Ted Wasana song voice, but, you know.
Ted Wasana song. Oh, Lord. Before we get started, just as a couple of quick things, just for some reminders. Remember that we do have Veterans Day coming up this Friday. Remember to thank a veteran. Confederate veterans are American veterans. This Thursday is the Marine Corps birthday, so thanks to all those, the few, the proud, the Marines that have served our country since 1775. Get the year right, Carl?
You got it.
Yeah, Ton Tavern. Hey, surprised you with that, didn't I? Anyway, and then at the end of the month, for those friends of ours in the Army of Northern Virginia, remember that we have Remembrance Day up at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There are some Confederate soldiers that mistakenly got buried in the National Cemetery up there. It's a really good place for us to show up, show out. I know the Virginia, Maryland divisions do a lot with that, so just something for y'all to consider. Okay. Well, before we, let's go ahead and get started with our topic. Carl, if you want to lead us off on it, I'll jump in when I can. And I think everybody will jump in when we can.
Well, I was, you're not going to believe this. I made myself some notes at my office, and I have them.
And you remembered them?
No, actually, I didn't. I drove off and left them, and I went to the grocery store. And while I was walking around the grocery store, I said, you know what? I left my notes at my office. So I went back and got them. All right. So I was just kind of jotted down some things to talk about today. And one of the things, you know, because we promoted this as Lincoln's assault on the Constitution and his expansion, unlawful expansion of the powers of the office of the presidency. And so I was, you know, kind of writing down some bullet points here to talk about some of the different ways that he did that. And what I realized is there's no way we're going to get all of them in one show. No. I mean, it's his entire presidency was, was a violation of the Constitution. One of the first things that I would point out, let's go back to, number one, you have the first sectional president. He was elected with 39% of the vote, of the popular vote, in a four-way race, handed to him partially because of the split with the Democrat Party when Yancey, took half the delegates to the Democrat convention and walked out, and that split the party. And Lincoln was not even on the ballot in 11 southern states, but yet he got elected. By the time of his first inaugural address, at least several, maybe all of the states had already seceded, or no, I think all but four had seceded. But his inaugural address was, correct me if you disagree or have anything to add to this, Ryan, but his inaugural address really was in my opinion, a de facto declaration of war against the South. And he made it explicit in that address. It was not over slavery. I mean, we all know the quote, I have no purpose either directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery to states where it exists. I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. He goes on to say, however, there will be, and if I remember the wording correctly, I haven't read it in a while, but I believe he said violence and invasion in order to collect the tariff and to secure federal property. Okay, so he announced there that his reason for invasion was over money, and it was fiscally driven, not humanitarian driven in any sense of the word. We also know in the same address that he voiced support for the Corwin Amendment. That was the first of 3 times during the war between 1861 and 1865 that he offered perpetual slavery to the South in return for their joining the Union and giving up their independence. And all 3 times they declined that. So I'm going to leave it there and let Ryan pick up from there. He goes on, of course, to illegally, and this is what I'd really like Ryan to address as we get started, but he illegally called for 75,000 troops for the purpose of invading the seceded states, and that was unconstitutional. I'm going to let Ryan explain why.
Well, you're right about that, particularly his inaugural address. And consider something else. The original draft of that address was much more belligerent than even what he said. When Seward saw the first draft, he said, "You can't say that.
Mm-hmm.
Back off." He said, "You're basically declaring war on them by doing that." And so he lessened some of the language, even though we could see it as being kind of belligerent. I've been working on a magazine article on some of this stuff, and the other day I just jotted down, just off the top of my head, Lincoln's violations. I'd like to read that as we get started. You said we can't take care of all of them. We could if we stayed all night, maybe into the next day, talking about all of them. But Lincoln illegally waged war on the states of the Union. We know that. He raised an army and called up the state militia without the consent of Congress, because the Constitution says it's Congress that raises an army. We have this notion that the president is a commander in chief. Well, he's not. That doesn't mean he can just do whatever he wants to do. He's a commander in chief when Congress has declared war and appropriated money and those kind of things. He used the military to occupy states to prevent their secession. He overthrew the elected government of Maryland and with state elections in Maryland to get a cooperative legislature. He defied the Supreme Court, threatened the Chief Justice with arrest, took steps to arrest former President Franklin Pierce, illegally created West Virginia, appropriated funds from the Treasury without authorization, because only Congress can appropriate money. He approved the use of military force against civilians in the Confederacy, blockaded southern ports to starve the civilian population, seized and destroyed private property without due process of law, violated the rules of war, mistreated Confederate prisoners, closed down 300 newspapers that were critical of his administration, seized control of telegraph offices, and censored the messages, rigged elections, and used troops to help him win re-election in 1864. He quickly approved 3 new states in irregular ways to solidify Republican control of the government, because there were 3 states that came into the Union during the war, and it was kind of irregular the way they did it. And not to mention, the heart of what my article is about is this illegal suspension of writ of habeas corpus to arbitrarily arrest thousands of people and put them in jail without. So take your pick on what you want to talk about tonight. That's just a little list off the top of my head that he did during the war. And people will defend him and say he didn't violate the Constitution.
Yeah, your list is very similar to mine, actually. I forgot about West Virginia. Didn't even think about that one. But I'll tell you a funny one real quick. Several years ago, probably 2009, 2008, sometime like that, I got an email that was sent to several of the division officers in Alabama from some left-wingers saying, "Ha, ha, ha, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Lincoln had the right to suspend habeas corpus. It says so in Article 1 of the Constitution." And I wrote him back and said, Article 1 delegates powers to Congress, not the president. I never heard from him again. But no, I want to go back to you mentioned marching the troops into Baltimore to arrest the state legislature. Any suspected supporter of secession in the Baltimore in the Maryland legislature was arrested.
And the Baltimore City government, including
right. And those, if I remember correctly, were Massachusetts troops that he launched in there. And we can go back to Alexander Hamilton on that in the New York Ratifying Convention when Hamilton said to march the troops of one state into the bosom of another would be a declaration of war. It would be the maddest, using force against the states in that manner would be the maddest project ever devised. Now, this is one of the biggest of the big government guys from the ratification era of the Constitution, saying, that 70 some odd years later, Lincoln was a tyrant.
And they were held for. I was going to say they were held under arrest for almost 2 years. Without any type of trial or due process or anything like that, completely violating their Fourth Amendment right, and Maryland stayed in the Union.
Yeah, and another thing Ryan said too that I'd like to touch on, because you're 100% right, and we still have this illusion today that the commander-in-chief has ultimate control over the military. No, he does not. If again, go back to the explanation given by the proponents of the Constitution when it was being framed and ratified, and what that meant, that the president as commander-in-chief meant that he could direct war once Congress had declared it, and once they had called for troops. And another thing I want to explain, I want everybody to hear this, because this is also very important. All right, so only Congress can declare war. Now, the president has the authority to make war. In other words, to repel an invasion, but the South never invaded. To declare war is a different act. And the historical meaning or the definition of a declaration of war, it means the recognition that a state of war already exists by virtue of the fact that an overt act of hostility has already been committed against us. Even Franklin Roosevelt got that one right. If you listen to his speech to Congress after December 7, 1941, he asked Congress to declare that a state of war exists between the United States and the Empire of Japan. So just on that one act of calling forth 75,000 troops and ordering them to invade, that one act alone was an impeachable offense, and possibly even a criminal offense.
Yeah, you're exactly right. No doubt about that. I mean, he started out breaking the law, violating the Constitution, and he never stopped, until the day he was assassinated.
Right. I was going to say, even the federal Supreme Court, you mentioned the blockade earlier, which is an act of war. I believe it was in Texas v. White in 1868 or somewhere around there, declared that the beginning of the War of the Rebellion, I believe is their exact words, they set the date as Lincoln when he ordered the blockade. The federal government, the Supreme Court says that essentially Lincoln started the war by ordering that blockade.
And if I'm not mistaken, that's when England granted us belligerent status to the Confederacy on the act of the blockade. I mean, we were at war. There's no question about that. But Lincoln was a lawyer. I mean, Lincoln was a lawyer, and he and I'm not trying to insult lawyers. I know there's probably some lawyers watching, and there's some very good lawyers. But if you look at his statements and the way he explained things, I mean, that's what he's doing. He's bending it, he's twisting it, he's finding ways around it, like the habeas corpus. He said the Constitution is not clear who can suspend it and who cannot suspend it. And that's just not true. As Carl mentioned, it's in Article 1. That in itself right there should tell you that Congress, the representatives of the people in the states, they're the ones that should decide whether we're going to suspend this. And that's only in a limited time. It's rebellions, and things like that. They can't just do it anytime. It has to be special circumstances. And if you look at the powers in the Constitution, where Congress has prohibited from doing certain things, that's where it's listed. And if you look at all the things it prohibits Congress from doing, it's specific powers of Congress. And the reason that's there in Section 9, Article 1, Section 9, is because it is limited on when they can do it. There's only a certain instances where they can suspend them. They couldn't just do it on a nice sunny day when nothing's going on. They have to have a reason for doing it. So Lincoln, again, Roger Brooke Taney, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, was exactly right. You cannot do this, and a whole host of other things. But of course, Taney almost ended up in one of their, well, I won't call them concentration camps, but people across the north called them Bastilles. That's what they were.
Yeah, and he housed over 30,000 prisoners during the war, political prisoners from the North, for infractions just simply criticizing or questioning his authority. He arrested and exiled Clement Vallandigham,
yep.
A sitting congressman, for criticizing. I think he sent him to Canada. If memory serves. Another thing, and Connor kind of touched on this that I would like to clarify tonight too, because we hear this all the time. Oh, well, your ancestors were traitors. They seceded. Secession is not an act of treason. I will tell you how in Article 3 of the Constitution, you can go read this. It defines treason there as it says, making or treason against the United States shall consist of making war against them or giving aid and comfort to their enemies. In other words,
Who did that?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, but there's a couple of key points to take away from that. Number one, the United States are, plural, a plural union, as in them and their, not an it, not a singular monolithic nation. But also, if, as Lincoln maintained, that the states had never seceded, if they were still in the Union, then he committed treason by marching troops into them and making war against them. So by his own words, he's the traitor, not the Confederate soldiers.
Yeah. And if the states were still in the Union, he was obligated to uphold the Bill of Rights and everything else. But of course, if you notice what he says, he said, well, they're out of their proper place they're in the Union, but they're out of their proper place. He comes up with all this just brand new stuff that nobody's ever heard of before to justify what he did, which is illegal, and he knew it was illegal.
I believe it was illegal or is against the international rules of war also to blockade your own country.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, I think the Supreme Court upheld this. Lincoln's explanation was that they are out of the Union for purposes of blockade, but in the Union for purposes of everything else.
Yeah.
And don't ask me to source that. I read that several years ago, but I think that actually did come up in a Supreme Court case, and the court upheld it. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, he said the same thing, something similar with West Virginia, because the Attorney General came to him and said, wait a minute, you really can't do this. You're really almost in a hypocritical situation because you're advocating secession. And Lincoln's response was, well, there's a difference between secession in favor of the Constitution and secession against the Constitution.
Which West Virginia's secession for the Constitution wasn't really for the Constitution. Constitution says that you cannot create a new state out of a area of an existing state.
Without 2/3, you got to have 2/3 approval of the state legislature, which it was never brought before the state.
They created a new one in Wheeling, West Virginia, and said this is the newly constituted legislature of Virginia, who had no representatives from the rest of it. So it was totally, the whole thing was illegal and in a sham. But they'll still defend him to their dying day. I don't understand that.
Well, what is curious is how many conservatives, because we get this from the left and the right, they both admire Lincoln, which should tell conservatives something. If y'all both have the same favorite president, somebody's being a little bit, somebody's applying a little bit of a double standard here. And I think one of the most dangerous things he did, we talked about, and we've given just a few examples among dozens and dozens of him stepping outside the Constitution, expanding the powers of the office of presidency. But he also set a very dangerous precedent that I think carries forward to this day in terms of going to war. Fort Sumter and his his shenanigans there, for lack of a better term, was a prelude to what Woodrow Wilson would later use in getting us into World War I. There is very strong, I think, irrefutable data that came out after the Freedom of Information Act that Roosevelt used the same tactics as had been used at Sumter to intentionally provoke the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor. You have the Gulf of Tonkin incident. By the time you get up to the Middle East with W. Bush and Obama and various others, Fort Sumter has become a model for our meddling and our world policeman role to this very day.
Yeah, and that's to simply push somebody into a corner and antagonize them to the point that they have no choice but to shoot at you, and then step back and say, "Hey, they shot at us. We got a prelude. We got an excuse to go to war."
Yeah.
And that is a progressive agenda. That is not a conservative agenda.
It's not Jefferson.
Well, it's the birth of American imperialism, for lack of or for a right term, because the British Empire did the same thing. You look what happened with Islam Luanda, with the Zulu and everything like that. They created the British Empire did a prelude to war for everything. Forcing some third world country or some smaller force to get into war with them and kick their butt and expand their territory. I mean, it's the same thing we have. Look at the United States military bases across the globe right now. We were just talking about before the show started, Carl in Okinawa. Stuff in Spain. Bases in frickin' Germany still. He created the birth of American imperialism.
Oh, you're right. He was the first
completely against. Which is I can't remember who it was. I think it was Fernando Wood, who referred to Lincoln on the House floor during the debate of the 13th Amendment as the American Caesar.
Well, you know what, and I'm gonna attempt to sell some books for my friends Ron and Donnie. They've got a book out. I don't remember how long it's been out, called Yankee Empire. Well, there's Ron. He's going to promote it for me. What the American Empire did with regards to Hawaii alone is worth the price of that book. I knew that we had been imperialistic in Hawaii, but I did not know the details until I read that chapter. And this is back, just a few decades after Lincoln's administration. By the late 1890s, the progressive era, when it kicked in, the Lincoln model of government and of Lincoln model of presidency was put into place. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, who we all know was a progressive, and I would debate him as, depending on what day you catch me on, either the second or third worst president in American history. He gleefully proclaimed that the ultimate outcome of Lincoln's victory was that the government, through its courts, is now the final arbiter of the limitations of its own power. That was the ultimate legacy of the Lincoln presidency, as that all power was centralized in Washington, D.C. The 10th Amendment was nullified and negated by force of arms and bloodletting, and this country has not been on the right path ever since. He was the heir and the founding father of progressive left-wing government. Let me give you something from his own words. And I was going to kind of throw this out there and see if somebody can guess who said this, but we'll all know who it was. This could have come from any left-wing candidate or politician in our modern day, but this is Lincoln talking. He says, "To elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuits for all, to afford to all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. This is the leading object of government for whose existence we contend." It sounds an awful lot like the Yankee view of it takes a village.
Sounds exactly like the Great Society is what I was thinking about.
Sure.
Yeah. It all flows back to Lincoln. It comes out of Lincoln. And don't forget Theodore Roosevelt. He pushed it a little bit further, and Wilson, and now we get where we are today. But it goes back to Lincoln. You look at America before Lincoln. Study Jeffersonian America. It was probably the freest, most prosperous country in the history of the world. That's what Don Livingston says, and I absolutely agree with him. And I'm hard pressed to find anywhere on earth more prosperous and more free than Jeffersonian America. That was what the founders had wanted, but Lincoln destroyed it. I mean, he didn't save the Union; he destroyed one and replaced it with another one.
Right. It was a revolution. I mean, it truly was. It was the French Revolution come to America. One thing I'd like to ask you, Ron, I mean, I got my opinion on this, but I'd really like to hear yours, is if you take Lincoln's presidency out of the equation, do we have a progressive era?
God, I don't think so. I really don't think so, because that sort of opened up the can of worms the way I see it. I mean, look, Andrew Johnson came in, and Andrew Johnson was not a bad president the way he's been portrayed. I mean, he was actually very good when you look at what he did, trying to uphold the Constitution. And of course, they were going to get rid of him. But through that era, until we really get to Roosevelt, you don't hear, aside from Cleveland, those presidents are not very well known. One of my political science professors called them postage stamp presidents, because he said if they weren't on postage stamps, nobody'd know who they were. But I've looked at some of their writings and letters, like Rutherford B. Hayes, and you see a lot of progressivism in what they were. I mean, Rutherford B. Hayes was even talking about what we know today as Social Security and old age pensions. Go look at what the Republicans did with soldier pensions, a union soldier pension. That was that was a massive welfare system right there. A lot of progressive ideas were starting to come out. And I just think that Lincoln, you would not have had that without Lincoln and that war. I think that's the most destructive thing that's ever happened to this country. I think we've been unable to repair it. We've had some attempts, but we just have not. That's my take on it.
I don't think it can be repaired.
I don't either.
As Jefferson called the 10th Amendment the cornerstone of our constitutional system.
Yeah.
And ultimately, among all of the articles and amendments of the Constitution that Lincoln violated in his exercises of power, the most important one that he destroyed was the 10th Amendment. Once you had nullified the rights of the states to interpose and to stand up, to come between the federal government and the citizens of that state, you have destroyed the cornerstone. And what we have left is a governing system that has now been built on a house of cards. It's got a sand foundation. It is arbitrary. They make the rules up as they go along. I read somewhere that prior to 1860, the only contact that the American citizen would have with the federal government was at the post office. Yeah. And other than that, they were out of our. Another interesting thing that and this one, I can't tell you where I got this. This is from the book I'm sure you read by Jeffrey Rogers Hummel, Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men. And he made a point in there that prior to 1860, the average American, or the average government spending would cost about $2.90 per American citizen.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we, finagle that into today's money, equalize it in today's money, I'm going to guess that's somewhere. Last time I looked it up, it was around $89 in today's money. Yeah. Okay, so prior to Lincoln, your tax burden, or the spending burden of the United States Congress would have been about $89 per person. Today, how many thousands is it in that each American is born something like $25,000 in debt the day that they take their first breath?
Well, yeah, what do you work till? What's the date now? It's well into April that you work every year just to fund the government.
Just the federal government. If you add the states, you're into June and July.
Yeah, that is just absolutely. I can't fathom how we've gotten that far off.
Well, when you
We were better off in the British Empire.
no,
We had $1 a year or something.
yeah. Well, when you look at it, I was writing an article for my camp's newsletter that I'm still working on, and I was doing just the economical impacts of the war. And right now, the estimate is at $138 per person back then, is what they would have paid. And the South was, of course, 3 times higher than that by the end of the war with the destruction of all capital and stuff. But the guy who wrote the article I was pulling the statistics from, says that if you look at the South, not only economically but politically, between 1861 and 1877, the federal government was just the instrument of pushing the radical Republicans' ideology on the United States of America. And if you look back on what the radical Republicans or the Republican Party as a whole, which Lincoln was a Whig, but you look at the Republican Party as a whole's ideology of that era, it was the Northern Industrial Complex, Northern banking, and free soil agriculture. And you see that all throughout Lincoln's administration with the Free Soil Act that I think was in 62, 63, somewhere around there. And the rest of it's just purely Hamiltonian ideology.
Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln, they unleashed crony capitalism run amok. That's why you see the budget just go through the roof. Cleveland tried to get it back, but it's just, I mean, look at where we are now. I mean, look at how much the government spends on just cronyism. It's unbelievable. But
monetizing debt.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, you didn't have that before Lincoln, or very much of it. People just weren't for it. That's why Clay never could get elected. Nobody wanted that.
Yeah, a friend of mine went on one of those school trips with his daughter to Washington, D.C. And when they got to the Lincoln Memorial, the guide, very cheerfully says, "Okay, who here can tell us something about Lincoln?" And my friend, the guide's expecting freed the slaves. And my friend says, "Gave us the first income tax and created the IRS." And when he said that, everybody turned around looking at him like, "Is that true?" And the guy, "Okay, let's just move along."
And speaking of that tax, it was for people, and this may sound familiar to a lot of folks. It was increased on folks who, percentage-wise, who made over a certain dollar amount a year. Does that not sound vaguely familiar to what the Democrats have been trying to push for the past, 6 years?
They never change. I tell the time. I even tell my students, progressives, look, Puritans, Yankees, liberals, whatever you want to call it, they've never changed. They've been the same since Plymouth Rock. They've never, since Boston. I mean, they've never changed. The mindset is exactly the same. If you sit and listen to what they're saying, it's never changed.
We must dominate you for your own good.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is too, and I believe in being fair to Lincoln, although when you're fair, he's still a tyrant, but compared to Stevens and Sumner and some of these other people, he was actually a moderate by comparison. So this whole idea that the Republican Party started, has ever in its history been conservative, that's a joke. That's ludicrous. You've had some conservative people that have been Republicans, like Robert Taft and like Barry Goldwater and Ron Paul and maybe some others. But the party as a whole has always been a progressive party.
Yeah, I mean, the only real true conservatives we had are Harding and Coolidge, and they made sure that they were destroyed in history, so we don't get any more of them. We get Hoovers and Tom Dewey's and those types of people, the Eisenhower wing. I mean, that's why Taft never won. How much better we'd been off if Taft had been the president of the United States instead of,
Yeah, well, that's why I get annoyed when I see references to progressive Republicans or establishment Republicans as rhinos. No, they're not. They're not rhinos. Those are real Republicans. Rand Paul is a rhino because he's a conservative. The so-called rhinos are real Republicans. They're Lincolnian. The whole party is Lincolnian.
Lindsey Graham.
That prime example. Perfect example. John McCain. McCain was a real Republican, and with the capital R. I don't mean Republican as little r as in a Republican form of government. I'm referring to the party. And I've heard it said I can't remember if it was Clyde. Well, I think it was Clyde Wilson that I read this on years and years ago. But the Republican Party, or I guess people who fled the Republican Party, probably former Whigs, flooding into the Democrat Party is what had turned the Democrat Party into just another progressive party by the late 1800s. So what we've had as a result of starting with around the 1890s up until the present day is a choice between big government with the Republicans or gargantuan government with the Democrats.
Yeah, conservatives, there's no Jeffersonian party at all. We don't have one.
Jefferson could not get elected to dog catcher today. He couldn't because people would think he was crazy. If he comes in talking about, state sovereignty and all of these things, limited taxation and state-controlled militias in place of a professional army and, all these things, that he would not have a chance. But that is the reality of what America was founded on. It was founded on the idea of separated powers and self-government. And Lincoln's ultimate legacy is that he derailed that. He committed treason against the founding of America.
Yeah, he did. He destroyed the Jeffersonian ideal, the traditions of the country, the ideals of the American Revolution. They were not upholding that. And I heard Clyde Wilson make a point, and it's actually very interesting. Go look at the leaders of the South, the leaders of the Confederacy, trace their heritage back to the American Revolution and see what you find. Then go do that with the Northern leaders like Lincoln and others. Jefferson Davis, others, Joseph Johnston, all of their fathers had fought in the American Revolution. You don't find that nearly as pervasive in the North, and I think that makes a big difference.
Oh, I think so too. I think it points to the as we've talked about many times, the differing cultures as well. The South is America. What made up Southern culture was also prevalent in states like Pennsylvania and New York. The views of government until Yankees out of New England began moving into those places and taking control of their government. Does this sound familiar? It's happening in Southern states to this day.
And those people didn't like it either. When you go read what they had to say when the Yankees came in, the Puritans, they thought, we don't want these people here because they knew what they were going to end up doing. And that's what they did. Really, if you can trace it back to the War of 1812. There's an effort by New England to vilify the South. Just, and they got a 40 or 50-year campaign of doing that.
Rewrite the history. Take over the culture. They couldn't control the government. Right.
They took over the culture, and it finally paid dividends. As Clyde Wilson says, by Lincoln, Yankees had gotten control of a lot of institutions in the country.
Yeah, and then look at the after effects of Lincoln's victory. One of the first things they did was set up 2,000 schools through the South. Yeah, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Horace Mann view of education, which he took from a Prussian model, which was designed to create subservience to the state among Prussian school children. It's brought over here to New England by Horace Mann, and with Lincoln's victory, it is now forced upon the entire country, and we deal with it to the present day.
Look at the colonial South. The colonial South did not follow New England on education. There is no public education in the Southern colonies. And in most states, up until Reconstruction, there wasn't any. It was left in the hands of where it should have been left, in the parents or private schools or something like that.
Local communities.
Yeah. Local issues.
Yeah.
And that's not the way New England saw it. But of course, with Reconstruction, like you said, I know they did that in a lot of states. They established public education in a lot of those Southern states because look at what they said. They're trying to make the South like New England.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you go back and look at Washington. We just had Halloween. Well, look at Washington Irving's description of Ichabod Crane.
Yeah.
In the beginning of the book, you mentioned that he's a Connecticut Yankee coming to this rural part of New York with his Yankee ideology, his superiorism, and he's going to get the people of this Sleepy Hollow to start thinking with the scientific modern way of thinking that he believes in.
Yeah.
Check out Washington Irving's political writing sometime. Very good.
Yeah. One other thing, you know, I think we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot to some degree when we bring up Lincoln's racism. He was an ardent racist. I don't criticize him for that, for the specific reason that I believe that plays into the hands of our enemies. It's practicing presentism. And if we look at just about anybody from the 19th century through the modern lens, they're all racist. Okay. They're all misogynist. They're all this, they're all that. Well, what I'm interested in is what did they do? What are the long lasting accomplishments? Not how did they see race? How do they see religion? Those types of things. But I have to bring up that Lincoln's his opinion, his attitude towards slavery was not in any way meant in an altruistic or humanitarian sense. Yeah. It was, again, it was power. Slavery for Lincoln and the Republican Party from its inception was a euphemism for power. And I mentioned earlier that 3 times through the war, Lincoln offered the South perpetual slavery in exchange for their rejoining the Union, so he could collect their taxes. He wouldn't have a free trade zone at his southern border, and he wouldn't lose the 75% or so of federal income. Those 3 times were, as we talked about, were in his first inaugural address, his voicing of the Corwin Amendment in that same address. Then in September of 1862, he announces the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed nobody in the North. It freed them, and only freed them, quotations, only in the southern states. And he gives those southern states 100 days to rejoin the Union, at which point the proclamation will no longer apply to them. His own Secretary of State said, "We show our sympathy with the plight of slaves by freeing them where we cannot touch them and leaving them in bondage where we could set them free." So that's the second time. The third time is at the Hampton Roads conference, when he tells Confederate emissaries, just rejoin the Union, you'll have the votes to defeat the 13th Amendment, and you can keep your slaves. And I believe Lincoln's plan for freeing the slaves would have left slavery intact until 1906. I think it was Brian McClanahan said that the other day. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, it's in his 1862 annual message to Congress, where it was a 40-year or so gradual emancipation of slavery. And he was going to, I think they were going to pay $300 or $400 per slave gradually over about 40 or 45 years. And then read on, it says colonize them outside the country.
Right.
And that's December of 1862.
Did Lincoln have a hand in setting up Liberia? Because I know Liberia was one of the countries that was established for the purpose of colonization. Was he involved in that?
No, that was during when Monroe was president. So he'd have been a kid, but he was certainly a proponent of it. I mean, Clay, right. The American Colonization Society. If Clay would have joined any organization, Lincoln would have been right behind him.
Right.
Daniel Webster was in the American Colonization Society. Francis Scott Key. There were a lot of prominent Northerners that were too.
There was again, you see Lincoln's double talk with regards to slavery. He always says, "I have no inclination to end it in the states where it exists." Yeah. What he wanted to stop was it spread into the Western territories. Now, why was that?
Well, it's controlling the political narrative. Or not narrative, but controlling the political power.
Right, I agree, but I wanted Ron to give us the details.
Oh, I'll give the answer. He can get the details.
Go look at what he said and what Northerners said. They're overwhelmingly opposed to that. Now, understand, they always accuse conservatives and Jeffersonians of using code words. Slavery is a code word for race or black. They said, we don't want slavery out there. That's not what they mean. They don't want black people out there. And you can see that. Began with the Wilmot Proviso in 1846. at the onset of the Mexican War. Wilmot Proviso, David Wilmot openly called his proviso the white man's proviso. They wanted those territories free of blacks. And of course, later, we're going to clear out the Indians next. So don't worry about that. You know, all of the things that they passed in 1862 was for the benefit of white. They might say free labor or something like that, but they didn't want black people out there. The North had a fear of amalgamation. That's another reason they hated the South, because the South, a slave society is integrated by its very nature. It has to be. And of course, with, the Sally Hemings thing and all these other things that went on in the South, they thought it was sometimes a little too close. But that horrified Northerners, this idea of mixing blood. Just go read their writings. They seem to be obsessed with this idea of being pure-blooded. It's kind of interesting when you trace that out, those ideas and where it heads. I was thinking Central Europe in about the 1930s. But anyway, they did not want that to happen. And there's an exchange between Lincoln and Douglas in an earlier debate. Most people don't realize, people think the Lincoln-Douglas debate in 58 was the first time they'd ever met. They knew each other for 30 years. They had been antagonists for 30 years. They had debated before. And it was in an earlier debate, and they were debating that issue, Kansas and all of that kind of thing. And Lincoln says, if Judge Douglas, what he called him, he said, if Douglas's plan to prevent amalgamation is better than our plan, being the Republican plan, he said, we'll drop our plan and adopt his. Now, that'd be like Biden. Look, if Trump's plan's better than mine to do something, I'll drop mine and take his, accept his. That'd be an unheard of thing to do. But his thinking was, we got to prevent this from happening. And he said himself, if you don't want white and black people to mix race or mix blood in Kansas, don't let them get together in Kansas. So the idea is to keep them out. There's a whole racial component there. You see it all through the Republican Party. Throughout the 1850s, Leland Stanford. I mean, you can quote everybody, Seward, everybody. And that was the whole point behind it, was to keep it as a refuge for white people and keep blacks out. So keep slavery and black people bottled up in the South. And of course, don't let them go in the free states either. I mean, you're very familiar with that. There were laws in Illinois and Oregon and all kinds of states. In Illinois, Lincoln's Illinois, if you were white and you brought a black person into Illinois, you would get whipped for doing that.
Yeah, they called it, I believe Lincoln himself called it a corrupting influence.
Yeah, well, and that's one thing. For the most part, I despise the movie Lincoln, but there are parts of that movie that they did get correct. And in there, one of them, it's a scene where he's in the cabinet room and he's trying to essentially buy votes to get the 13th Amendment passed through Congress. But he gets up there and he says, "I'm the president of the United States, cloaked in enumerated power, or numerous powers, get it done." But earlier in that entire movie, there's this couple from northern Missouri, that came in and was disputing a claim that some federal governor had taken away a ferry that they operated, gave it to somebody else, and I think it was John Quincy Adams had given the family, the right to operate the. Anyway, that doesn't matter. Secretary of State Seward asked the family, "Well, how do you feel about the ending of slavery?" And they say, "Well, if it ends the war quicker, okay with it," because that's what Lincoln says. And Seward asked him, "Well, what if the South was to come into the Union right now?" And they said, "Right now and end the war, we'd prefer not to have somebody from Alabama come up here and start stealing our chickens." And that's a good representation of the Northern populace during that era.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I've always thought too, and Ryan, you might can touch on this, that another of the underlying motives in Lincoln's desire to keep slavery bottled up in the South was to stop the agrarian, economic, and cultural traditions from spreading into other states in an effort to choke off and neutralize Southern representation in Congress, and therefore to expand the powers of the Republican Party.
Absolutely. I mean, that's another issue. They didn't want any more slave states to come in. you have to understand the Northern mindset on the Union. The North supported the Union as long as it benefited them, and or if they could dominate the Union. Look at the times they threatened secession. It was when they were falling behind or thought they were falling behind and couldn't control things. That's when they wanted out. They were always in favor of it as long as they were in control of it and they could do what they wanted to do. And so they're like a lot of left-wing political animals. I mean, everything had to do with politics, and they would do whatever it took to maintain control. That's why they passed all the things that they passed during the war, and then eventually gave up on Reconstruction once they had solidified their economic policies and other programs. They knew they were going to control it for quite a long time. So, yeah, they didn't want it to spread out at all. They didn't want Southerners to spread out anywhere. I mean, don't think that most Northerners cared anything about black people. They didn't at all. By virtue of the fact that they didn't want them up there. I mean, during the war, there was an effort to relocate some to Massachusetts, and they blocked it and said, no, you're not bringing them up there. You know, other states did the same thing. So, you know, it's just like the illegal immigrants they sent to Martha Vineyard a few weeks ago. What happened? They ran them off. They didn't want them up there. Leopard doesn't change its spots. It's the same Puritans that are there today. Are they're just exactly like the ones during the war or in the 1600s.
Well,
Contrary to popular opinion, Jim Crow started in Connecticut, not the South.
Yep. You're exactly right.
You look at the casualty statistics for draft riots, and the fact that the guys who were rioting up there, because all of a sudden you could pay $300 and not have to go fight in Lincoln's War, or you could be conscripted in service. They went to the black part of New York and took out their vengeance on them.
Yeah.
Because if all of a sudden you're drafted to go to war, when you come back home, your job has been taken by somebody else, in their opinion, that's being paid 30 cents to the dollar that you were making. Suddenly you get back home. If you make it back home, you're not gonna be able to provide for your family at that point. That was a lot of the thoughts behind that and why they went and attacked that section of New York.
Let me read a quote from Congressman John Reagan. Y'all probably heard this quote, but I'm going to read it for everybody. Reagan, later the Confederate Postmaster General, and by all accounts, ran the best post office in the history of America. Very well-run Confederate post office. But this is what he said while he was in Congress before the war. He's talking to the North. He says, suppose the people of the South would today voluntarily surrender $3 billion in slave property and send their slaves at their expense to the free states. Would you accept them as freemen and citizens of your state? You dare not answer me that you would. You would fight us with all your energy and power for 20 years. He was exactly right.
Another thing, Ron, you mentioned early in the show was Lincoln's use of military troops to secure his own reelection. I think that's something that's not well known. It doesn't get talked about a lot. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I haven't done a lot of work on it. That's something that somebody needs to do is really look at the 1864 election. And there were a lot of shenanigans that went on in that election. And even some pro-Lincoln biographers, David Herbert Donald, even admitted that Lincoln would not have won the state of New York without the bayonets. It was at the point of a bayonet, the troops there ensuring his election, because New York in those days was the big swing state. It had a lot of electoral votes, and it swung both ways, and you really needed New York. And he would have lost it without doing that. They did a lot of furloughing and of troops and let them go home and vote. And at the same time, this is what I found interesting. At the same time, they were accusing Democrats or the other side of trying to rig and steal the election. There were a lot of news stories during 2020 saying the same thing. Democrats were, trying to steal the election from Lincoln in 1864 and all this kind of stuff. When really it was Lincoln that was behind a lot of that. There was a lot of that. I mean, they had done it. We mentioned earlier in Maryland, they had used troops and shenanigans in Maryland in their state elections in 1861 to ensure they had a compliant legislature. And he just kept the same model throughout, even though they maintained control of Congress. They lost a lot in the midterm elections, and Lincoln himself thought he was going to lose in 1864. So if you think you're going to lose, guess what you do? You do whatever you have to do.
So you mean you're here to tell us that stolen elections are not a conspiracy theory that happened to just materialized in the last couple of years?
I'm sorry to tell you, we have a history. I can show you elections in the 19th century where 3 or 4 times as many people voted that lived in the district or the city or this or wherever. That's the problem with democratic type government, and really a republic as big as ours. I mean, republics don't function well the size we are. Even the original states. I mean, Jefferson thought Virginia was too big. He wanted to divide Virginia into ward republics, kind of like Switzerland. It's hard to control. I mean, a state like Alabama or Mississippi is pretty big for a republic. And when you look at their immigration policy, and that's when it started with the progressive just poured in a bunch of immigrants, particularly when they opened it up to Eastern Europe, and these people don't know anything about it, and they vote 4 or 5 times. These things have never changed. They were doing it then. They do it now. There's no difference. It's like they got the same playbook and they pass it around through the years, and everybody just it's the same thing. It should be fairly obvious to people by now.
Yeah, politics, it doesn't change. I think what, potentially has made it worse is that so much power has now been centralized. We don't even pay attention to our state elections anymore. I mean, even the term Brian McClanahan brought up years ago in one of his books, even the term midterm elections is a clue as to where our real focus is. It's on the national elections when it should be at home. I make this point all the time that if you really want to take back power from Washington, D.C., you need to be focusing on who your governor is, who your state legislator is, those sorts of things. If you could get just a handful of states to elect people that were conversant in the theory of nullification, and if they had the integrity to enforce it, that's how you strip back power. That's the only way that we're going to reverse the flow of things. And the flow, in my opinion, I mean, it started with Lincoln. Lincoln was the first progressive president. We've had very few exceptions since him that were not, in fact, themselves progressives. And it leads us, to where we are today. He was the catalyst for everything wrong in government to this very day. He devised a system and forced it into place at gunpoint.
It really shouldn't matter who the president of the United States is. I mean, he's restricted by the Constitution. And Lincoln should have came in and said, "Look, I can't do anything about this." If he'd acted like a Jeffersonian, what did Jefferson himself say when states wanted out of the Union upon his election? Hey, go in peace.
Yeah, I have no hesitation in saying, let us separate.
Let's separate.
You cannot have free government. I mean, I heard Donnie Kennedy say this a million times over the years, and I've stolen it from him. Of course, I always try to give him credit for anything I steal from him. But if you can't leave, you're not free. Right. And I mean, that is a very simple but a very true statement.
Yeah. If I came to your house and said, "No, you can't leave," I mean, that's false imprisonment, kidnapping, whatever you want to call it. But don't you love Tom DiLorenzo's explanation though? We're like a battered wife. We're beat up, and then the husband wants you to come back into the marriage and think everything's okay after that.
So he beats you up, subdues you, and hey, voila, the union is saved.
Yeah, everything's fine. Forget about it. Let's not talk about that anymore. But you can't leave. If you try to leave, I'll do it again. I mean.
Well, the bright side of all this, and I was telling somebody this the other day, it was about 1998, 1999, when my epiphany began materializing. I really did not. I growing up, I never was really a student of the war between the states. I had grandfathers and great grandfathers, uncles, that sort of thing, that were all World War I and World War II veterans. And that was really kind of where my interest in history lied, was in those wars. But in the late 90s, my wife and I took a trip to Williamsburg, Virginia, and I always try to get a book from wherever I go. We went over to this bookstore, and I bought a book on the American Revolution. And I thought, man, I'll never read this. It's about 600 pages long. Well, I wound up reading it about 5 times. And one of the things that stuck out in there to me, this is going to tell you, I'm telling myself now, this is going to tell you what a nationalist I grew up being. But I remember towards the end of the book, the war was over. They were getting ready to form a new government. And it talked about how Jefferson was against a strong military and a strong central government. I threw my hands up there and thought, what the heck was wrong with Jefferson? I thought he was a patriot. So I equated patriotism to military and economic strength. And I had to find more out about this. And so I started studying Jefferson. Eventually, you know, I found writers like Tom Woods and Kevin Gutzman and Clyde Wilson and Brian. And interestingly, all of them said the same thing: check out primary sources. And when I started doing that, I knew something tragic happened. How did we get so far off the rails? And then about that time, Tom DiLorenzo comes out with his book, and that was the light bulb for me. I mean, it just completely shook my whole worldview up. But what I was going to say was, I can remember when I started discovering these things in the late 90s and early 2000s, and I worked with a lot of very conservative people, and had a lot of very conservative people in among my family and friends. And when I would go to them and say things like, well, you know, the state can nullify that. That's a violation of the Constitution. They thought I was insane, you know, but I couldn't find any allies anywhere that were along that same line of thinking. But today, I think we're seeing the ripple of a change beginning to take place. And it's because I think of people like you and Brian and various others putting books out, doing podcasts, doing things like we're doing tonight, that hopefully will open somebody else's eyes up.
We have to just keep doing it, no matter what it is. Just keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. Because the other side's putting out their filth every day.
Sure.
Books. I saw a new one coming out on Lincoln, and I thought they just never stop. They never stop. And so we can't stop. We have to keep on. We have to answer every one of them and do what we can. And I think you're right. I think people are doing the same thing. They're reading these things. They're seeing these podcasts. They're looking at social media. And now some people are closed-minded, numbskulls, and you're never going to reach them, and don't even try. But there's a lot
of just disinterested in general.
Yeah.
Well, really quickly, while we got a pause, it's a perfect time for us to pay our bills. Moose, you want to talk about what you got to talk about, and then we'll take our commercial break? And he's muted, or we can't hear him.
I'm going to hit a couple of our sponsors all at once. We got a couple things I was asked to talk about. First off, I want to remind everybody that November is Native American Confederate Month. So that is awesome. We have a clip on Rumble from the Kennedy twins, about 16 minutes. I was able to watch it a bit before I had to get on. I've been stuck doing classwork all day, so sadly I wasn't able to watch it all. But again, go watch it on Rumble. Learn more about Native Americans in the Confederacy, what they did, who they were, and of course, just honor and learn more history. And that's something I've been looking forward to this year, is all the extra history I've been able to dive into. These guys don't know it yet, but I'm going to pick their brains for resources after this episode. So y'all pray for them, because I'm going to, when it comes to picking people's brains on resources for stuff like this. So go check that out. On our other bit of sponsorships, please remember Southern Flags and Quilts. Southern Flags and Quilts is a Dixie-owned company. You're not sending your money up north. You're not sending it overseas. You are sending it to Alabama. Some people call it the heart of Dixie. I call Mississippi the heart of Dixie. But, you know, we can disagree. And if you have any just quarrels about her work, let me tell you, phenomenal work. Here's just some of the flags that she sent us pictures of. Here's a forest flag. I'll throw in this Louisiana flag for Chuck. All these, a Metcalf flag. Look at all these beautiful flags. They're great in quality too. And she made our flag, so you can trust me my words here. She has done fantastic work. Again, you're supporting a Southern-owned company, Southern-based company. Make sure you support her. Historically correct flags, great pricing, and she works her butt off for you. Now, our last sponsor for the evening, it's a new one. It is sponsored by 1175 Firearms. Conroe facts. The Conroe fact of the week is that Conroe was 9 feet tall when he was born, and throughout childhood, he shrunk to his present height.
It was because of all the rain.
Yeah, it's because of the rain that he gets in about mid-Mississippi. And again, this is brought to you by 1175 Firearms Training. I had nothing to do with this whatsoever. Please, the good Lord, have mercy on my soul. I'm going to throw all that on Carl. That was all Carl.
Except for the text facilitating. Hey,
we ain't going to talk about that. We ain't going to talk about that.
what do you think about having a Conroe fact?
Carl, you started this weeks ago. I don't want to hear it. I was reminding you. Carl, you can't know me. He's above me on the food chain, Carl.
If we're going to be completely forthcoming, Thomas Franklin started it because he can't type Connor. Apparently, can't spell Connor.
Yeah. Bless his heart.
Thomas Franklin calls people whose dogs are missing and barks at the phone on them.
Isn't he going to be on the Christmas episode? Did I hear that right?
Something like that. He's going to either be teaching us how to make a turkey or flock trees or possum raising.
Christmas decorating.
Speaking of Native American, what's that?
He thought he was spelling it right. So it's CONOR, Thomas, not CONRO. I can get your confusion. But thank you to all our sponsors, Southern Flags and Quilts. And please go check out that Native American Confederate history video posted on by the Candy Twins on Rumble. Link for all this great information is in the chat, so please check it out. And remember to share tonight's great episode to get that information out to people. And we will take a quick Pop-Tart break, and I guess we'll be back.
No, we're going to take a full commercial break. We're going to skip the Pop-Tart break. But one person we really want to give a shout out to is our executive director, Adam Southern. Today is his birthday. So in order for everybody to give a good gift to Adam, we're encouraging everybody to make a donation to the SCV, either the museum or one of our funds. In your memo line, in your check, or on PayPal, remember to put Happy Birthday Adam on there.
And friends' links are in the chat if you want to support us via that way.
Yeah, we need to. Ryan has been so good to come on whenever we've asked him to. We need to mention too that he's an author and has 4 or 5 books out now. You got 1 or 2 on the program. Got one on the whitewashing the election in Mississippi. That was a fiasco. And then the book on Harding and one on Cleveland. And I think those 2 are very, very important books to read. They go hand in hand with what we're talking about tonight, because Harding, Coolidge, and Cleveland, were the antithesis to the Lincoln era. They were opposition to the Lincoln, whatever the Lincoln narrative, the Lincoln way of doing things, the Lincolnian system.
Yeah. Yeah, particularly in terms of foreign policy, they certainly were. But look, in the future, I've got some plans for some Southern history books, and they're going to be some humdingers. So hopefully I can get them out in a few years.
Good.
Yeah, I need to get your on Harrison and I both need to get your book on the McDaniel campaign. I volunteered here in that campaign, the campaign after, and he's doing something with McDaniel now behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So.
Oh yeah. I appreciate the plug, and I do what I can.
But the link for Mr. Ryan's books on Amazon, that is, I'm sure there's a couple other websites you could go on to find books, is in the chat if you want to go support him. I am about to get a couple of his books, hopefully. By me, I mean my family, for Christmas, because this is my one per episode. I'm a broke college student and I have no money. So I
Been there.
I have to with Connor on. So I'm basically.
Can I shamelessly plug one other thing?
Please.
Yes, go ahead.
I am mentioning the Native American Month. I did a profile of Elias Cornelius Boudinot, who was the Confederate representative to the Confederate, the representative to the Confederate Congress from the Cherokee Nation, and that should be in the Confederate Veteran Magazine coming up. I don't know when they're going to run it. So he's a pretty remarkable guy. So that should be coming out maybe in a few episodes or editions.
Well, we'll bring you on.
Yes.
Well, anytime, all you got to do is let me know, and I'll be here.
Well, we're going to pop up this commercial and be right back with some more Lincoln bashing.
I've always been proud of my Confederate ancestry, but I never pursued becoming a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. It all changed in 2017 when I saw New Orleans take down their Confederate statues. Those monuments come down really lit a fire inside of me, and came to the conclusion I needed to join the Sons of Confederate Veterans. It's a domino effect. We give in on this, it's just a matter of time before they start taking down Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. We need to draw the line in the sand right now. These are our Confederate monuments, these are our Southern heroes, and you're not going to take them down. Our museum is going to be funded 100% by the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The history, the narrative that we present will be the narrative that we write. So it will be our story, our museum. Right now, if we do not protect our heritage and present it as it truly was, it's going to be lost forever. We're going to tell the true story here. I'm Adam Southern, and I'm a proud descendant of Private Alfred D. Southern, a Confederate veteran.
So I want to piggyback really quickly back to the election of 64. Ryan, in your research, I can't remember where I found it, but I was doing some research on Camp Douglas and the 80 acres of hell up there. But I found an account where the Lincoln administration, at least the Republican Party in Illinois, which of course is Lincoln's home state, actually arrested several folks who would have voted against him and housed them in Camp Douglas. Have you seen that?
Not that specific account, but that happened all the time. Look at the political affiliation of most of the people that were arrested. The political affiliation of the newspapers they closed down. That were critical of the administration. So yeah, they did a lot of things politically, used troops and manufactured votes and all that kind of stuff. And I mentioned I haven't looked deeply into it, but 3 new states came into the Union during Lincoln's first term, Republican states. I mean, that's to add electoral votes. Everything, so much of it was done that was politically. The newspaper editors that were arrested, and a lot of them, and the article I'm writing, it centers on the suspension of habeas corpus, and I'm calling it Lincoln's prisoners, and I'm doing a profile of some of the most prominent ones that were in prison. And here's what they did. They bring them into prison and leave them in there for a few months. Then they would say, okay, we're going to let you out, but you're going to have to sign these documents saying you won't take anybody to court or sue anybody over your treatment. Knock off what you're doing, and you got to sign this document that you won't bring any type of charges against anybody. I mean, that I was dumbfounded when I read that.
Picking back to the DiLorenzo thing, that is the battered wife.
Yeah,
there.
Yeah, we're going to beat you up, and then we'll be back together, and don't ever bring this up again. You can't tell your version of it. It just makes no sense, and I don't understand anybody with any common sense can defend any of it.
You know, the one of the things that I have noticed over the years, I couldn't begin to tell you how many, probably hundreds and hundreds of debates that I've had online, either on social media or even before social media came about. And the one glaring similarity that all of our detractors have when they say that the North was right, that Lincoln saved the Union, or that the South committed treason by seceding, or the secession was an act of war, or any of these things, the one glaring commonality that they all have is I have yet to meet a single one of those people who had even what I would consider a fourth grade level understanding of the Constitution and our formation, the Union's formation. I mean, it is an absurdity how ignorant they are of it. Just like the individual I told you about earlier that said, well, Lincoln had the right to suspend habeas corpus. It's in Article 1. Well, Article 2 creates the presidency, not Article 1. Article 1 gave that power to Congress. That's who I was talking to. I had another one tell me that in the Confederate Constitution, and I'm not going to name who this was, but most of our listeners would know his name if I were to spit it out. I may or may not have challenged him to a debate earlier.
Uh-huh.
I'm dead serious. I would love to go toe to toe with him. But trying to tell me in a message that Article 1 of the Confederate Constitution forbade the states from ending slavery. No, it did not. Like Article 1 in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1 in the Confederate Constitution was directed towards Congress, not the states. Other than Article 1, Section 10, those were the prohibitions against the states in the U.S. Constitution. Everything else is a delegation or a prohibition of power to the Congress. But the knowledge or a lack thereof of the Constitution and just the basic framework of our Union among these people it's absolutely criminal how badly educated they are.
And when you get into deeper subjects like sovereignty and where sovereignty resides and how it was ratified, and Madison said, look, the Constitution got all of its authority from the ratification conventions. The states empowered it. That you really get over their head with that.
Oh yeah, when you try to, I think a lot of them think it was the state legislatures that ratified. No, it was not. It was ratified in convention, by the people of a community appointing or electing their delegate to go and represent them. So when Alabama ratifies the Constitution and enters into the Union, that was a direct act of the people of that state. Madison said it. If I can find this quote real quick, it's in one of the articles that I wrote a few years ago for Abbeville. But here's Madison on from Federalist 39. It appears on one hand that the Constitution is to be founded on the assent and ratification of the people of America given by deputies elected for a special purpose, but on the other, that this assent and ratification is to be given by the people, not as individuals composing one entire nation. That's another very, very common misconception, that one American people ratified it. Not as individuals composing one entire nation, but as composing the distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. It is to be the assent and ratification of the several states derived from the supreme authority in each state, the authority of them, the people themselves. The act, therefore, establishing the Constitution will not be a national, but a federal act. In other words, it is state by state. When we talk about we, the people of the United States, we're talking about we, the people of Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Oregon, Louisiana, so forth and so on, the people of each state. So Lincoln's actions in using violence and invasion against a seceded state was a de facto act of tyranny and treason against the original framework of the Constitution. It was an act against the people of the United States.
Yeah, you got it exactly right. There's no other way to see it. And to get around that, they have to do a lot of lying and just misconstruing history and you know, you have debates with these people all the time, and it's really fun to do it. I like to do it not because I'm trying to raise my blood pressure or anything. I like to see what they say. I want to hear what their arguments are. What's your justification for it? And it's, you know, you learn, and most, of course, you find out it's basically the same thing that they regurgitate. But yeah, I mean, they don't understand the ideals of the revolution. If you don't understand the revolution, you don't understand the true nature of the Declaration of Independence. You certainly ain't going to understand anything about what Lincoln did. I mean, he destroyed all of that, even though he's out there saying how much he likes the Declaration, and he talks about the Declaration and Jefferson and these things. But the heart of the Declaration of Independence was not all people are created equal. That's not all men are created equal. That's not the heart of it at all. That's not it. It was a secession document, or that the people themselves have a right to decide what type of government they're going to live under.
Everything up until the last paragraph was just a reiteration of English law.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what I always ask, why could the Southern people, why could the South not decide what type of government they want? Why do you deny them that? It's something I like to ask them and to see what they say. Well, you know, you just couldn't do it. You just couldn't do it. You just can't do it.
I had one conversation with a guy that this was at a party. I have a lot of fun at a party. I'll tell you how big a nerd I am now, but I had a party and having this discussion. This guy was getting kind of perturbed with me. And he said, you know, once the states entered into the Union, they surrendered their sovereignty. They became wards of the central government. And I said, well, not according to Jefferson. I said, you know, Jefferson said in the Kentucky Resolution that the states in joining the Union are not bound by unlimited submission to their general government. And he says, well, he must have said that before the Constitution. I said, no, 1798. It was during the pseudo war with the French. And his only comeback after I told him that was, well, Jefferson was a nut.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah, okay. Well, you made a good point the other day on Facebook, Carl. If you look at the ratification convention debates, you're not going to hear a single person say this is a perpetual union that you can't. No. You don't see that. You would think you would see it at least one time, and you don't. Mm-hmm. But you see the other side of that many times. That we can retrieve our delegated powers anytime we get ready.
If any state had believed that once they ratified the Constitution, they could not get out, not a single state, including Massachusetts or Connecticut, would have ratified.
They never would have ratified. But
the first 6 attempts or conversations about secession, starting as early as 1794, regarding dissolving the Union or leaving the Union, were done by New England states. Yeah. Now, here's one a lot of people don't know. I believe it was Emerson. I believe it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who actually who proposed secession to get away from the slave states.
Yeah.
If we can't end slavery, well, let's just secede and we'll no longer be politically connected with those. So everybody in New England knew that secession was legal.
Yeah, a lot of abolitionists had that. A lot of abolitionists positioned when the South left the Union. Fantastic, let them go. Now we're done with it. Let the rest of the slave states go with them, and we don't have to fool with them anymore. But when you understand, as we've talked about, what was Lincoln's mindset? Lincoln was an economic animal. That's the only thing that was on his mind. And there's a lot of books that talk about that. I mean, Lincoln, if you before he became president, if you look at all of his writings and speeches, more than half of it is about economics, tariffs, banking, currency, internal improvements. The Henry Clay American system. He talked about that and spoke about that and wrote about that more than he did anything else, even slavery in the sectional crisis and that kind of thing. That'll tell you a lot.
It was the Northern Whig philosophy, basically. It seems like it's that one thing, and maybe you can answer this. I've gotten the impression. All right, so Lincoln was born in Kentucky, okay, but I've gotten the impression that his father, stepfather, whatever he was actually raised him according to a Yankee culture, a Puritan type of culture. We know Lincoln was an atheist. A funny comment I heard, I don't remember where I read this, but because, you know, after Lincoln was killed, the martyrdom took hold, and all of a sudden Saint Lincoln was born, when everybody really reviled the man up until that point. But his law partner, I believe, was asked, is it true that Lincoln was a Christian? He said, of course he was. He became one 6 months after his death. And that you know, he was pointing to the PR campaign that took place. But Lincoln was raised, you know, an atheist or maybe a universalist or something of that nature. Do you know anything about his upbringing?
Yeah, I know his parentage is very obscure. You know exactly where he came from. I know there's been a lot of conspiracy theories and things like that. His father, his mother. You know, there's a lot of talk about his mother being less than virtuous. I'll just put it that way. Of course, extreme poverty and that kind of thing. So, of course, people hear all the myths. There's so many myths around Lincoln. Even David Herbert Donald said most of Lincoln, what we know about Lincoln is myth. You know, the rail splitter and all that kind of stuff, and taught himself how to read, and he read the Bible all the time. And I've even had people that are, you know, in my family that said, well, Lincoln was a Christian. He used to quote stuff in the speeches all the time. And I said, really? Do you believe everything a politician says in their speeches? You know, and you're right. His law partner, Herndon, even said he was not. He said he used to, in private, he used to ridicule Christians and ridicule the notion of Christianity and the precepts of Christianity and the virgin birth and the Savior and that kind of thing. There are a lot of good books on the real Lincoln and the Lincoln nobody knows and that kind of thing. And it's really quite eye-opening. As racist as he was, he liked to tell cruel, vulgar jokes, you know, with ugly words and that kind of thing. Heard a lot of stories. He and his wife didn't get along real well. There was a story that in Springfield one day, she was kind of loony anyway, and was almost put in a mental institution a time or two. There was a story that she was chasing him down the street with a butcher knife because she thought he was seeing some other woman in town. I mean, you know, of course, Lincoln's melancholy, and, you know, he was melancholic, what they call manic depressive today, and that he was twice put on suicide watch. And his friends came to his house and took all of his knives and razors away from him. And he even said himself, I never carry a knife with me for that particular reason. So when you dig into the psyche of Lincoln and his background, it's not what they have portrayed in Hollywood and in books. And I remember reading those books when I was a kid, you know, the little books you read when you're a kid, and it made him seem like this great man. But when you dig into his background and you find out, I mean, he was a money guy, he was a lawyer, you know, he represented railroad interests. He actually represented slave owners trying to capture fugitive slaves. I mean, that's why William Lloyd Garrison called him that slave hound from Illinois. Have you heard the new book that's come out? And I've not been able to get a copy of it. It's called The Lincolns in the White House, that makes the allegation with court documents that Lincoln sold slaves. Have you heard that?
I've heard about that. Yes.
I've been trying to get it. I've even contacted the publisher, and they say they got, you know, back orders on this book. And he dug it up in records in Kentucky that slaves, you know, her family was a slave owning family. I mean, Lincoln's brothers-in-law fought for the Confederacy. I mean, you talk about a divided family. And of course, in a lot of southern states in those days, women couldn't own property. They certainly couldn't own slave property, so it was bequeathed to their husbands. And apparently, some slaves came to her, and of course, they went to Lincoln, and Lincoln actually had ownership of them. Now, the great emancipator, we know, went right down to the courthouse and said, I'm going to manumit these slaves right now and set them free, and I'm going to carry them up to, you know, the northern states or Canada. That's probably exactly what he did, right? If you listen to Hollywood and the establishment, that's what he did, right? Wrong. He sold them back into slavery to reap the rewards of that. He sold them into slavery to another plantation. He has court records that establish this. I can't wait to get my hands on that book to find out. Now, how do I know that might not be true? Or how do I know it is true? Now, here's a rule of thumb. That book's not listed on Amazon. that tells me there's probably some truth to it. When they've shut this out and we can't get copies of it, they don't sell it online. That would wipe out the rest of, or should wipe out the rest of his reputation right there. I mean, Lincoln was a money man. I haven't been to his home in Springfield, Illinois. I want to go up there, but Tom DiLorenzo says it's in a ritzy section of town with, I guess, a ritzy section of town in those days. And Lincoln's house is the biggest one in that whole neighborhood. So again, when you look at the type of person he was, and he was obsessed with economics, obsessed with being Henry Clay. Somebody mentioned that he was a Whig in the White House. He was a Whig to the day he died, even though, and that's what he was trying to do. So when you study his personality, you study the way he really was. It's not Steven Spielberg version of it at all.
I got a hold of a book a few years ago, and by I think it was Edward McMaster, or maybe Edward Masters. I can't remember. It was written in the 1920s, and this man's family.
I think it's called Lincoln the Man or something.
Lincoln the Man is the name of the book. They actually knew Lincoln. His father knew him really well, and he knew him, through his father. But it gets really into his psyche, I guess, for lack of a better term. But one of the things that stood out to me was there's a chapter in there on his relationship with women. And, they quoted some of the letters that he wrote to Mary Todd and another woman that he dated before her. And, to me, what struck me was an extreme amount of, like you said, melancholy, but also narcissism.
Yeah.
I mean, his approach to women was almost, to the point where he was doing them a favor by even corresponding with them. It was a very condescending, approach, it seemed like. And I think that carried over into other aspects of his life. I mean, ultimately what you have in Lincoln on every issue that I can find is the Latin term was libido dominandi, the lust for dominance. And, he wanted to dominate the country. He wanted his party to dominate the country. It was all about power. Everything he did centered around power, whether it was in his personal life or his political life.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. Now think about this. I said this in a speech one time. I think it was over there, Carl, with the Alabama Education Conference over there. Look at the top three people in the Confederacy: Davis, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee. And then look at the top three most prominent in the Union: Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman. You wouldn't find three better people in the world when you look at the character of Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. But you look at Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman, you get two manic depressives that were put on suicide watch, and one's a total drunk. I mean, that's really the three that they came up with.
And possibly the most corrupt president. And possibly the most corrupt president in history.
Yeah.
And didn't Sherman die in a psych ward? Is that true?
He might have. I know he was on suicide. He was in the care of his wife in 1860, right when the war began, secession and the war began. And I know he was contemplating suicide. Now, I've never been in the military. I know Carl could speak to this, but my brother was an officer in the Air Force. I got a good friend of mine who's a lieutenant colonel in the Army. And they have told me, and I've talked to others, I said, the way I understand the rules in the Pentagon now, if you've ever been treated for depression or anything like that, they don't let you lead troops in combat.
No, you're not even getting in the military, I don't believe.
Right. But we put this guy in charge and say, just go tear up across the South and burn. We put a pyromaniac in charge, and you find that in Lincoln's army. There are foreign commanders that came over and committed all kind of atrocities, and instead of kicking them out or prosecuting them, and you probably heard of the Russian commander. Didn't he do some stuff in Alabama? And Lincoln stated him to command. I mean, that right there should tell you when you put a guy like Lincoln, a melancholic guy like Lincoln, in charge of the Army, and he puts people like that in command of troops, what's going to happen?
Yeah, that
so
was.
Don't tell me it's malice toward none and charity for all. I mean, don't give me that. You know.
Yeah, that was. You're talking about Ivan Turchin. They sacked and burned the city of Athens, Alabama, and rapes were committed, and various other atrocities. And he oversaw all of it, and he was brought up before a military tribunal and court-martialed, and Lincoln pardoned him and promoted him to brigadier general.
Yeah, that right there should tell you everything you need to know. You don't have to go any further than that. But anybody would do that. But if they want to defend that, go ahead and defend. You're a fool if you do. But yeah, with malice toward none and charity for all, at the same time Sherman's ripping across the Carolinas,
Right.
It's just, the whole thing is just tragic.
Well, I remember, I don't know who said it. It was a Soviet commissar, and this may or may not be true that it was said, but it's a very good anecdote anyway. A Soviet commissar was said to have proclaimed, our future is known. It is our history that keeps changing.
Yeah. And you see that in the Soviet Union. They would actually take people. You can see photographs of Stalin and several, high-ranking members of the Soviet government, and then somebody would fall out of favor with Stalin, and he'd have him executed, and they'd have him airbrushed out of the official portrait. I mean, yeah, that's exactly what it is, and we've adopted the same model.
Well, the Lincoln myth, it seems to me, I see more and more evidence of it today. Even I noticed an article online by the New York Times criticizing Lincoln. He's being criticized from all cultures now. The concern I have is, do we learn the right message from this? It's not enough just to come to the awakening that Lincoln did some bad things. We've got to realize that those bad things are still present in our system, and that they are at the focal point of what is wrong with our modern day system. As we said earlier, Lincoln is the catalyst for the ongoing progressive era. It's the ongoing reconstruction of the South. And until we revive the Jeffersonian principles, you cannot have honest and true government, a true Republican, small r form of government.
Well, they don't want that, and they don't want this democracy they keep talking about, which is foreign to us and should be foreign to us. We know what that's about. They're not interested in any of that. It was perverted then, and it's continued to be perverted. It's just going further and further to the left, and it's just really sickening how far it's gone. And I don't know that there's any people are hopeful. We're going to retake Congress tomorrow.
Yeah. And when we do, nothing will happen.
Yeah, because it's full of a bunch of Republicans. It needs to be. If it was full of Jeffersonians running it, I might think differently.
Yeah.
But that's something I want to do one day, is talk about the fact that we put so much emphasis on the president, and that really started with Lincoln as well, to some degree with Andrew Jackson, but Lincoln. The president now is the center of everything. He's become a celebrity. Congress is the strongest of the three branches, and Congress was supposed to run the show. The president, it wouldn't have mattered who the president was. That's why most of them you didn't know. Even in the antebellum period, presidents would, go out and walk around town and go to shops and go to restaurants, and just like somebody else walking down the street, nobody cared. And in those days, when people came to visit Washington, they didn't care who was in the White House. They wanted to go to Congress and sit in the Senate gallery, and they would say, "Hey, where's Calhoun? Where's Webster? Where's Clay? Where's Thomas Hart Benton?" That's it. That's what they wanted to see. Those were really the stars in those days, not the president. Now everything centers around the president. Tomorrow's like McClanahan said earlier in one of his broadcasts. Tomorrow's the midterm elections. Why is it the midterms? Why isn't the presidential election the midterm? What we should be doing is saying, yeah. So if we had that type of notion, we had that type of Jeffersonian Congress like we used to, where you didn't have crony capitalism and that kind of thing going on, it'd be a far different place. Jeffersonian America was a far different place and a much better place. And what we've done is perverted our founding ideals. I mean, they've been corrupted. You ever seen the original movie Red Dawn? Yeah, it's a great movie, right? Go watch the concentration camp scene again. And you know, when the boys go to find their father in the concentration camp, he says to avenge me and all that. Listen to the that they got a propaganda film, and you can hear the broadcast of that in the background. Go listen to what they're saying. You know, I'm gonna use a little bit of a bad word, but I remember it said America is a whorehouse where your founding ideals have been corrupted. And I'm thinking, I agree with that. I mean, I actually agree with that, because they have been, and that's when they were corrupted. Not just corrupted, they were destroyed, and they were meant to be destroyed. And the South had to be destroyed. Look at the economics of the South before the war. The South was the richest states, by far the richest states, far richer than states in the North. Go look at Time on the Cross, Fogel and Ingram, and go read that book, Time on the Cross, and you'll see just how wealthy the South was. And that's another Kennedy book that we need to promote here. Punished with Poverty. Look at what happened after the war. I joke about that in my class. Mississippi was the richest state in the country on the eve of the Civil War, and I said, and then after the war between the states, I said, after the war, what happened? We're the poorest, and I said, I can attest, we're still the poorest. Been a
and it's taken 100 years for the South to even come anywhere close to reviving itself. I believe the South, depending on which data you look at, was the 4th or 5th largest economy in the world.
Yep.
And in a 4-year period, that was crushed. And I would make the argument we still have not recovered, because so much of the economic boom in the South is facilitated by Yankee business moving north and establishing itself.
I was about to say, there's a book that came out in the 90s called Dixie Rising, which dives into the American culture being Southern culture, but they talk about, that now, like Nissan, or just talk about Mississippi, Nissan, Toyota, all these other places are moving from up north and coming down here, because we still have not industrialized as much as they are, but they're bringing down their liberal ideologies, Yankee ideologies, with them. Just a couple of years ago, Nissan tried to unionize, and we're a right-to-work state here in Mississippi, but that ideology came from Detroit, and that same ideology, and as long as there are northern executives in charge of what's going on with these businesses, they're not going to be pro-Southern. You're going to have folks like Nissan and other large companies that move down here to the South, and then they decide, or they influence what goes on in Mississippi, at least the state politicians, and then your local politicians as well, because they're not going to want to run them out. Look at those who came out supporting the change in the state flag: Nissan, Toyota, the big universities. I mean, it's just on and on and on.
After the state gave them hundreds of millions of dollars in these crony capitalist deals, that would have set me off to hear them do those kind of things. But go read Hamilton, go read Clay, go read Lincoln. They thought crony capitalism was the way to go. This is all their whole system. They thought that was the wealthy people supporting the government, and of course the government passing favorable laws. They thought that was exactly that. That was the best system.
The bond market was devised as a means of selling government debt to the largest corporations and bringing these large businesses into bed with the government. Think about it. Government debt bonds are backed by government taxing power. And so the richest people in America owning government bonds are going to be more supportive of more protectionism and more taxes so that they can recoup on their investment. That was right out of Hamilton's playbook, and Lincoln followed it.
The tax code's a joke. The IRS is a joke. You're never getting rid of that. People talk about a flat tax or whatever else. No, every time you try to say that, when wealthy people come out and say to get rid of the tax code will support what will be a help to wealthy people, that turn it around, because it's not, because that's the way it's set up. It's gobbledygook for a reason. They can hire the lawyers and the accountants and the people to get through that. You and I can't. So that was the Hamilton. That comes straight from Hamilton. Would have been in hog heaven today. He'd say, "This is fantastic. 31 trillion in debt. Let's pile some more on it." He thought it was a national blessing.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think step is abolishing the 17th Amendment. There, I said it.
Well, I'm with you.
That would be a step. The 17th, 16th, and 14th, all three need to go. I mean, there's nobody representing the states in the United States government today. An interesting thing, the states prior to the 17th Amendment would have the power to shut down the federal government by refusing to appoint senators.
Yeah.
And the 17th is taken out away by putting it on a democracy. There's that word again, model. And again, I would make the argument that would not have happened had Lincoln never come into the picture.
Yeah. And somebody asked me here just a few weeks ago, how did 3/4 of the state legislatures ever adopt the 17th Amendment? And I said, well, that's a good question. And I said, that was right during the heart of progressivism. You had a lot of legislatures, even in the South, that had been bitten by progressives, progressive Democrats. And a lot of them, you study the history of progressivism and how they were selling that kind of stuff. That's when they start using the word democracy like they use today, that we want to be more democratic and you need to elect your own senator and that kind of thing. And again, like we've said tonight, most people don't even understand what that was there for. Why did the legislatures elect the senators? There's a specific reason why they were called representatives of the states, representatives of state sovereignty. They were called ambassadors of the states to represent, just like you would a regular ambassador. Everybody has one equal number.
And think about how hard it would be to buy off the government. Lobbyists would have no power if the senators were appointed, because not running for election, they have no reason to have a campaign coffer, and there's no place to pump money into. So repealing the 17th would I think curtail an awful lot of the corruption and the big money coming into the government today.
Right, which would put it back in the hands of the people of the individual states more than what it is now, because
the unfunded mandates and the things that the states are having to pay for. If you're a United States senator, you're going to vote for all that and then go back and face your state legislature and say, oh, by the way, I just strapped billions of dollars on you that you're going to have to tax the people to pay for. And he'd have been out the door. They just had to hit the door. It wouldn't have happened. So every little obstacle to crony capitalism and all of this was knocked down one at a time. And right along with that, somebody put in the comments there was the Federal Reserve. I mean, all of that comes in right at the same time. And we got rid of the old constitutional treasury we had since James K. Polk, and then the Federal Reserve System came in, because what we had was, starting with Jackson and later with Polk, was separating the government from the banks. So, and that was essential. And of course, they went way past Hamilton's vision with the Federal Reserve, no question about that. So you see all these things, these obstacles that get moved out, that get knocked out of the way to fulfill that Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt vision for the country.
Well, you hear all these different proposals to so-called fix the tax system. Let's go with a flat tax, a fair tax, this tax, that tax, blah, blah, blah. Here's the bad news for you folks. As long as you have central banking and fiat currency, I don't care what you do to the tax system. They can still tax you at 100% through manipulation of the money supply. Yeah. And again, that comes exactly out of the Hamiltonian vision. The first and second banks of the United States, we've got one now, it's permanent. There's not even any government oversight. In over 100 years, it's never been audited.
There's no, I mean, they create that entity, Federal Reserve, and then set it aside and say nobody can do anything with it. They can do whatever they want to in secret meetings that we don't know what's going on. We've never seen minutes of these meetings. We don't know what they talk about. I talk about that. I would love to see Thomas Jefferson say, hey, by the way, look at what we've created. I mean, you think the first bank of the United States was bad. Let me tell you about this one. Yeah, fiat money, all of that came out and said, well, look at the greenbacks they created during the war and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you see all of these things beginning to happen. And, of course, we've got them on steroids now.
That was Dexter. He wanted to be on camera.
Well, that's nothing wrong with that. He probably knows more than a lot of people I know about these subjects. Not any of us, but obviously people we deal with on a daily basis out there.
Well, I don't know if we've convinced anybody of anything, but it's been a great discussion.
Really, really has. And we've been able to block a couple of trolls tonight. So that is always a.
No, we don't have any trolls, huh?
Yeah, same person creating 5 different profiles, but you know. But Rod, what you doing next Monday?
What am I doing next Monday?
Yes, sir.
I don't know what you want to do next Monday.
You want same thing we do every Monday, try to take over the world. No, you want to come back and continue the discussion and talk about some more stuff?
Sure, anytime.
I don't think we have anything booked for next week, so we'll meet you and let's just keep it going. But we've been at it for almost 2 hours, and I know there's more that we can uncover and talk about within the next week to, come up with questions and other stuff like that. So come on back next Monday.
Somebody asked in the comments, I'll put this out there, ask about that book, Lincoln Owning and Selling Slaves. It's by Kevin Orland Johnson. It's called The Lincolns in the White House. Kevin Orland Johnson, The Lincolns in the White House. Again, I'm trying to get a copy and maybe we can figure it out. But sure, we can come back and talk about whatever you want to talk about. I'm pretty much open book.
Maybe go back to Hamilton. I'd have to refresh my memory to bring back. I have to pull out Tom DiLorenzo's book, Hamilton's Curse, or Brian's book, How Alexander Hamilton Screwed Up America.
I'm gonna have to re-listen to it on Audible. That'll give me a week to re-listen to it. So that's a plan for me.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, for everybody who's tuned in and watched and stuck with us, we appreciate you tuning in. It has been one of our best discussions we've had in a while. Ron, again, thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it. Guys, remember this Thursday, do we have Look Around, or y'all trying to redo Commander's comments?
No, we'll be going back to Look Around. So make sure you send in your news to scvyouthOutreach@gmail.com.
That'll be 7 o'clock on Thursday night, Confederate Standard Time. For those that have asked, we've had some folks message the page privately. Everything is 7 p.m. Confederate Standard Time. It doesn't matter if the time changes or not, as long as it says 7 o'clock is when we go. But most of us are in CST, and it's just hard trying to figure out Eastern time zone and stuff like that. As a reminder, we do have our Christmas episode coming up. We've got a bunch of great other stuff just planned. Think at the end of the one day this month, we're supposed to have the Commander-in-Chief on just regular SCV chat. We may or may not have an episode live from headquarters in December.
Ooh, interesting.
There's that for y'all to look forward to. Remember, say again?
And the gag reel.
Yeah. Remember, guys, we still have folks who have been affected by the flooding this year by Hurricane Irwin down in Florida. Remember that we do have the SCV Relief Fund. Please, 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 if it's in your heart, donate to that. Donate to the museum. Again, happy birthday to Adam. We'll be back Thursday and then following Monday. If you're joining the chat late, we will have a rerun of this episode this Wednesday at 7 o'clock. Remember to check out Look Around Southwest Florida with Sean McFall, the Alamo City Guards chat with Christian Lee. And until next week, unless something rips or tears, remember, no Fumar in the elevator.
No Fumar in the elevator.
Rudder for up.
Ref rock.